The storm arrived without warning, tearing through the forest with a violence that seemed almost alive. Rain fell in sheets, drumming on the leaves like thousands of tiny hammers. The wind bent the trees until their branches groaned in protest, and the muddy ground became a slippery, treacherous mess. In the midst of this chaos, a tiny kitten crouched under the shelter of a fallen log, his fur soaked and sticking to his frail body. His little chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath, and his wide eyes scanned the darkness around him, searching desperately for any sign of safety. The kitten had never known such a storm, never felt the kind of fear that made his whole body tremble uncontrollably. His tiny paws sank into the mud as he tried to move, but he could not run fast enough to escape the roaring wind, nor could he find a proper place to hide. Every gust of wind seemed to howl directly at him, shaking his fragile frame as if testing his courage. Even more terrifying than the storm itself was the fact that his mother, the one constant in his life, was nowhere in sight. She had been chasing a mouse earlier, following it with the quiet, elegant steps that the kitten had always admired, but she had gone too far, venturing into a narrow crevice between two jagged rocks, and now she was trapped. The kitten could hear her faint cries carried on the wind, and the sound tore at his tiny heart. He tried to scramble toward her, but the ground beneath him was slick, and the mud pulled at his little claws, slowing his desperate journey. Each meow he released was swallowed almost immediately by the storm, leaving him feeling smaller and more helpless than ever. His whiskers twitched nervously, his tail curled tight against his body, and yet, despite the fear that threatened to paralyze him, he refused to give up. He had to save her. His mind raced, thinking of all the times his mother had protected him from danger, had nursed him when he was sick, and had kept him safe from predators. The memory of her warmth, her comforting purrs, and the way she would nuzzle him when he cried filled him with both sorrow and determination. The kitten's heart beat wildly, a mix of fear and resolve, and he realized that running away was not an option. He had to find help, anyone who could reach his mother and free her from the cruel trap of the rocks. With a deep, trembling breath, he began to make his way through the storm, moving as quickly as his little legs would allow. Every step was a struggle. Rain pelted him, the wind threatened to topple him, and the mud tried to swallow him whole. Yet still, he pressed on, his tiny meows echoing through the forest as if calling for an answer from the very heart of the storm. The kitten's eyes scanned the chaotic forest, searching for anything familiar or comforting. Branches snapped and fell around him, and his fur bristled with each thunderous clap of distant lightning. He stumbled over a root and tumbled into a shallow puddle, the cold water soaking him to the bone. Shivering, he shook himself, sending droplets flying in all directions, but he refused to stop. The cries of his mother urged him onward, each one a reminder that time was slipping away, and that she needed him now more than ever. The kitten's tiny body was exhausted, but his spirit burned brighter than the storm itself. Even the tallest trees and the heaviest rain could not extinguish the courage that had suddenly taken root inside him. As he paused for a brief moment behind a fallen log, he lifted his head to scan the forest again. A flash of lightning illuminated the path ahead, and for a fleeting second, he caught sight of something that gave him hope. A faint glow in the distance, like a flicker of warmth in the cold, relentless storm. Something deep inside him told him that this was the sign he had been waiting for. Summoning every ounce of strength and courage, he pushed himself forward, paws slipping in the mud, fur plastered to his body, meows trembling but persistent. The kitten knew that his mother's life depended on him finding that light, on finding help, on refusing to let fear control him. With each step, the tiny creature became something more than just a frightened kitten. He became a beacon of determination, a symbol that even the smallest, most vulnerable among us could rise to face impossible odds. Through the relentless sheets of rain, the kitten kept his eyes fixed on the faint glow that had appeared in the distance. It flickered like a tiny star struggling against the storm, but to him it was a lifeline, a promise that help was near. His small paws slipped repeatedly in the mud, leaving little imprints that were quickly washed away by the pounding rain, but he refused to stop. Each meow that escaped his throat was raw with fear and urgency, carrying the desperate message, My mother is trapped. I need help. The kitten's fur was drenched, plastered to his tiny frame, and his muscles ached from the strain of running and leaping over fallen branches and rocks. Yet, every step was fueled by love and determination, a force far greater than the storm surrounding him. As he moved closer, the light revealed itself to be coming from a small wooden cabin tucked at the edge of the forest. Smoke curled lazily from its chimney, a stark contrast to the chaos of the storm, and the warm glow spilling from the windows promised safety. The kitten's heart leapt. He had never been inside a human dwelling before, but instinct told him this was where he had to go. With renewed vigor, he sprinted through puddles and over slippery roots, sometimes tumbling headfirst into the mud, only to spring back up immediately, shaking himself off and continuing his frantic journey. Each crash of thunder made him flinch, but he would not stop. The thought of his trapped mother, her tiny meow still echoing in his mind, pushed him forward, overriding the fear that threatened to paralyze him. Finally, he reached the cabin door. Soaked through and trembling violently, he rubbed against the wooden surface, claws scraping faintly, and meowed as loudly as his tiny throat could manage. The sound carried differently here, amplified by the confined space of the cabin, and it was enough to catch the attention of the occupant inside. A man, elderly and slightly bent with age, opened the door, lantern in hand, and froze at the sight before him. There, in the pouring rain, was a tiny kitten, shivering and soaked, eyes wide and pleading. The man bent down slowly, extending a cautious hand. The kitten hesitated only a moment before darting forward, rubbing desperately against the man's legs, purring and meowing in frantic bursts, as if trying to speak a language only the desperate heart could understand. The man knelt fully now, eyes scanning the stormy forest, and understood immediately that something was terribly wrong. The kitten's urgency was palpable, and even without knowing the details, the man sensed the severity of the situation. He scooped the little creature into his hands, feeling the shivering body against his palms, and murmured soothing words, though they barely cut through the roar of the storm. The kitten wriggled and mewed again, nuzzling the man's hand, trying to pull him toward the forest. The man followed the kitten's gaze and finally understood. His eyes widened as he spotted the faint shape of another animal farther away, wedged between the rocks, struggling against the storm. The mother cat. Without hesitation, the man grabbed a sturdy lantern and sloshed through the mud, following the tiny guide who led him toward the trapped cat. The rain beat down relentlessly, but the kitten's determination never faltered, and the man found himself inspired by the tiny creature's courage. Each step was a battle against both the weather and the difficult terrain, but the kitten ran just ahead, mewing incessantly, guiding him to the precise location of danger. Finally, they reached the narrow crevice, and the man saw the mother cat, her body wedged tightly, claws scraping at the rocks, eyes wide with panic. The kitten leaped forward, circling her, brushing against her fur in a frenzy of relief and concern, as if to tell her, "Help is here. You will not be alone." The man knelt carefully beside the trapped cat, shining the lantern to assess the situation. His hands worked gently but firmly, moving rocks with careful precision, all while keeping an eye on both mother and kitten. The tiny kitten stayed at his side, mewing and nudging, refusing to leave, a little bundle of determination and hope in the face of impossible odds. With each careful movement, the mother cat shifted slightly, and the kitten's meows grew louder, more urgent, yet also filled with hope. It was as if his little heart knew that freedom was within reach, and he could almost taste the relief that was just moments away. The mother cat's claws scraped desperately against the jagged rocks, each movement sending sharp pain through her muscles, but she refused to give in. Her body was wedged tightly in the narrow crevice, and the storm's wind whipped rain into her fur, chilling her to the bone. Every so often, a flash of lightning illuminated the scene, and she could see her tiny kitten circling frantically above her, mewing as if trying to give her courage, trying to tell her that help was on the way. The kitten's little body shook, wet and muddy, but his eyes were fierce, full of determination and love, and the mother felt a surge of hope even as exhaustion threatened to drag her down. She pawed at the rocks again, straining, pushing, twisting, each movement sending sharp jolts of pain through her body. but she would not let fear or despair claim her. The man reached the crevice just as the mother cat's strength began to falter. He knelt carefully in the mud, setting the lantern down so its warm light illuminated the trapped cat. His hands were steady, strong, and careful, and he examined the tight spaces around her, searching for a way to shift the rocks without causing harm. The kitten leaped onto the man's shoulder for a moment, pressing his soaked little body against him, nuzzling his cheek with urgent insistence, and then darted back to his mother, circling her again, mewing louder, as if giving the man instructions, guiding him toward the right approach. There was an almost magical synchronicity between the tiny kitten and the man, a shared understanding born of urgency and love. The man began to move the rocks gently, testing each one, ensuring that nothing would slip or crush the mother cat. She hissed softly, a mixture of fear and warning, and the kitten's tiny voice rose in response, a chorus of encouragement. Every shift of the rocks required patience, precision, and care, but the man persisted, guided by the kitten's frantic urgency. Occasionally, the mother cat would wriggle in the tiny space, claws scraping against rock and mud, and the kitten would respond with sharp, insistent meows, circling her in a protective frenzy. Rain poured down around them, soaking both human and feline, but none of them noticed. All that mattered was freeing her, reuniting mother and child, and ensuring that they were safe from the storm's wrath. Minutes stretched like hours, the rain relentless, the wind tearing at the trees and pushing against the man's body as he worked. The mother cat's muscles screamed with exhaustion, but a flicker of light appeared in her eyes as she felt the pressure around her begin to ease. The rocks shifted slightly, creating a narrow opening just wide enough for her to move. She pawed at the gap, twisting and turning with careful precision, following the invisible guidance of the man's hands and the kitten's urgent meows. The kitten's tiny body pressed against her, tail flicking, eyes wide and glimmering, urging her on, giving her the courage she needed to make the final desperate push. Then, with one last strained effort, the mother cat twisted her body and slipped free of the jagged rocks. Mud splattered as she tumbled onto the ground, soaked, shivering but alive. The kitten leaped onto her immediately, circling her, nuzzling her head, rubbing against her wet fur, mewing loudly, a mixture of relief, joy, and exhausted excitement. The mother cat blinked at him, her own body trembling from adrenaline and exhaustion, and slowly began to nuzzle him back. They pressed together, a tangle of fur and warmth amidst the rain, reunited against all odds. The man smiled softly, kneeling beside them, carefully lifting the mother cat into his arms. The kitten immediately followed, clinging to the edge of the man's coat as if insisting on being part of the rescue. The storm still raged around them, but in that small clear ring, a bubble of relief and triumph existed. The tiny kitten had guided the man, led him through the chaos, and refused to abandon his mother, and now, finally, the danger had passed. Their bond, already strong, had been forged even deeper in the crucible of fear and determination. The mother cat purred softly, her head resting against the kitten's small body, and he purred back, both of them exhausted but alive, proof that courage and love could overcome even the darkest of storms. The storm had begun to weaken, the wind easing into a mournful sigh, and the rain softened to a gentle patter on the trees. The forest, once a chaotic blur of shadows and noise, now seemed to breathe again, dripping and glistening in the muted light of early dawn. The man carefully lifted both the mother cat and her tiny kitten into his arms, cradling them against his chest. Their fur was soaked and matted, trembling from exhaustion and cold, but their eyes held something more than fear, relief, gratitude, and a renewed sense of trust. The kitten pressed himself against his mother, tail curled tightly around her wet, trembling body, and she nuzzled him in return, purring softly as if to reassure him that they were safe now. Inside the cabin, the warmth of the fire offered a welcome contrast to the storm outside. The man gently set them down on a soft blanket he had prepared, wrapping them carefully to help them regain their strength. The kitten curled immediately against his mother, shivering slightly but slowly relaxing under the comforting weight of her body. The mother cat licked his fur in gentle strokes, her purrs vibrating against his tiny frame, and he purred back, eyes half closed in relief. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and dry earth, a safe haven from the wet chaos they had just escaped. The kitten looked around cautiously, glancing at the man who knelt nearby, watching them with a quiet smile. He did not try to touch them further, understanding that the two needed their moment of reunion and healing. The kitten, small as he was, felt an overwhelming surge of pride and love. He had risked everything to find help, running through the storm, slipping through mud and rain, and calling out tirelessly for anyone who could save his mother. And now, here they were, together, safe and warm. The storm had tested him, had pushed him to the edge of his tiny strength, but it had also proven that even the smallest creature could make a difference. His heart swelled with the knowledge that courage did not depend on size or strength. It depended on love, determination, and the willingness to act when it mattered most. The mother cat, exhausted but alert, lifted her head and watched the kitten with eyes that glimmered with pride and relief. She had faced terror, trapped and helpless, and yet she had survived, thanks in part to her child's bravery. She nudged him gently, brushing her nose against his fur, and the kitten responded immediately, pressing closer, purring louder, a chorus of contentment and reassurance. Their bond, already unbreakable, had deepened in the crucible of danger, and neither would forget the events of the storm. In their small, intimate world, the storm was over, and safety had returned. Outside, the first rays of dawn began to pierce the clouds, casting the wet forest in golden light. The leaves dripped with sparkling droplets, and the air smelled fresh and clean, a stark contrast to the chaos of the night. The man standing at the cabin door watched the scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. The kitten darted forward occasionally to investigate the small room, exploring cautiously, then returned to his mother's side for comfort. The mother cat moved with a slow, careful grace, stretching her limbs and shaking off the last of the mud, while keeping a protective eye on her child. The storm had passed, but its memory lingered in the mud, the broken branches, and the chill that still clung to their fur. Yet, in this moment, hope had replaced fear, and life had won. As the mother cat settled back onto the blanket, the kitten curled against her chest, eyes closing in contentment, and she wrapped a paw around him, a soft embrace that said everything words could not. The man quietly stoked the fire, watching the two together, marveling at the tiny creature's courage and determination. Outside, the forest shimmered with the aftermath of the storm, sunlight glinting off wet leaves and reflecting in puddles like tiny mirrors. The air was alive with a sense of renewal, as if even the trees and the earth themselves were celebrating survival and resilience. The kitten purred himself to sleep, secure in his mother's warmth, while she rested as well, the soft rhythm of her purring matching the steady crackle of the fire. In that small cabin, surrounded by safety, warmth, and the aftermath of a great ordeal, both mother and child understood something profound, that courage and determination could overcome the darkest storms, and though the forest outside had been wild and unforgiving, the bond between them had proven stronger than any danger. In the quiet dawn, the world seemed to promise that no matter how fierce the storm, no trap was too strong, and no challenge too great. When love and courage were on your side,